Well, hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar, Is Your Food Defense Program Fit for Purpose in a Quality 4.0 World? So I'm your moderator, Adrienne Bloom, Editorial Director of Food Safety Magazine, and this is the 9th webinar in the Food Leadership Series brought to you by Food Safety Magazine, and it's sponsored by LRQA. So the Food Leadership Series brings together some of the food industry's leading figures to showcase their expertise and analysis. The format for this webinar will be a little different from what you're accustomed to. I will pose questions to our distinguished panelists for discussion, which will be followed by polling questions for all attendees, so keep your eyes open for those. Also, please submit your questions for the panelists throughout the presentation, and we'll conclude the webinar with a Q&A session. So today's event is also being archived and recorded on food-safety.com. So bringing together unrivaled expertise in certification, brand assurance, and training, LRQA is one of the world's leading providers of food safety and assurance solutions. Now, the roles of digital and technology are expanding in the control, monitoring, and management of food safety in operations and along supply networks. It's not a matter of preventing a cyber attack, but more about ensuring that your company is prepared when an attack happens. Our expert panel today will examine the increasing importance of cyber crime mitigation activities for the food industry, including warning signs, impacts of an attack, hidden vulnerabilities, and ensuring that your defense program is up to date. So, today's presenters are Kimberly Coffin, Global Technical Director of Supply Chain Assurance at LRQA, and Stuart Wright, Global Head of Governance, Risk, and Compliance at Netitude, an LRQA company. So, to get started with our discussion, I am first going to pose a discussion question to Stuart. Now, we know that cybercrime is a big area. What are the key types of cybercrime that present the greatest risk and impact to food businesses from farm to fork?
Yeah, it's a big area for sure. So I think some of the risks the food industry faces will be quite specific to them. Some of them will be, I guess, a lot in common with other sectors as well, though. So some of those threats are quite indiscriminate and opportunistic. So that's taking advantage of fundamental flaws, out-of-date systems and applications, misconfiguration, things like that. So essentially, these are flaws and vulnerabilities that we can actually relatively easily predict and put controls in place to address. So I suppose you could say it's kind of the cyber equivalent of an unlocked door, an unlocked window that hasn't been closed correctly. It's an opportunistic criminal, one who may well have a fairly basic skill set. They're going to try and exploit those vulnerabilities. There's also the use of operational technology alongside the IT. So that does introduce some kind of different and additional complexities as well. So that's where controls could be more difficult to implement. Other elements like uptime of systems, the importance of that comes into play. And that's where challenges, I've experienced in many sectors, including the food industry. It's around the use of legacy systems, unsupported devices, systems where the manufacturer has stopped fixing known security flaws, or they're perhaps completely obsolete systems, but their use is critical for your operations. You can't replace them, and therefore they are more vulnerable to being exploited. So I guess, on that point of the types of crime that could present a risk, I think it's important to remember as well that there are organised criminals trying to extract things like trade secrets, patents, IP, and so on. But in the main, I'll talk for a few minutes about perhaps the criminals where their end goal is more aligned to extracting money from you. So, this isn't like it was maybe 10 years ago, where attacks were about causing disruptions, showing off your skills, or just, doing it because you could and being mischievous. It is more likely about money these days. So the types of attacks that you're likely to see are those that have some kind of exit strategy, a way of getting cash from the victim. So thinking about the attacks are most likely and commonly observed, it's with the intent of extracting money from the victim. So you need to think about what attacks can cause operational disruption. Now that may well mean something like, and a lot of people will be familiar with this, but an attacker deploying ransomware, trying to disrupt you. And that's ransomware as criminals typically locking you out of your home, right? Preventing you from accessing your files, your systems, your applications, and demanding a ransom to restore access. Or it perhaps could be around denial of service attacks. They work by, say, looking at your e-commerce, your website, or part of your infrastructure. And an attacker will flood those systems with requests, effectively overwhelming them. And the end result being, much like with the ransomware, those resources become unavailable. So if you think about impact, either type of attack is going to have a similar impact, and that's loss of access to the resources you need to run your business. So, some examples, for instance, we've seen ransomware attacks take out warehouse logistics, point of sale devices in restaurants, shops, other similar systems that can impact on revenue. Obviously, my area of expertise is around cybersecurity. I'm not particularly an expert within the food industry, but I can imagine if you have, a warehouse or a distribution center that contains your fresh produce, and if you have a ransomware attack, and that means you can't access the systems you need to manage stock, to get your product loaded onto trucks and distributed to where they need to go. That if that stock is fresh, you have a certain amount of time, you're into the territory of you're risking losing money. And that's what the criminals are depending on, kind of bringing that all together. That's the operational impact that they're trying to use to convince you to pay a ransom. So, organizations, I guess in summary, you need to try and understand what kind of attacks are you likely to experience. There are those attacks that are common across most sectors, and potentially they're not targeted at you. And that's where operations are disrupted and the ransom is demanded, as we just talked about. And they're not, generally speaking, particularly sophisticated attacks, taking advantage of relatively basic vulnerabilities. And then there's the possibility of those more targeted attacks. So those are not so much interested in extracting money, but more sophisticated criminals who may want to access, as I say, trade secrets, patents, and so on. So they're very two different types of threat actor. So what we would typically talk about and advise our clients to do is make use of resources like threat intelligence, get some situational awareness, and that is to understand what are the threats, not just within your sector, but what problems are your peers experiencing, who might be targeting you specifically, and look to understand more more about that. And then alongside that kind of specific insight, think about obviously following, generally accepted good practices that all organizations should apply, food industry or not. Kimberly, I don't know if you've got any other thoughts to add to that.
Stuart, I thought that was an excellent summary with regards to breaking that big area of cybercrime down and really giving us some highlights and some insights with regards to what we need to be thinking about and where those most critical components are. And it really comes back to those threat actors. So that was a really good description as a novice cyber person and a true foodie.
Great, thank you both, and thanks, Stuart. Now that we know a little bit more about the different kinds and levels of seriousness of threats out there, let's move on to another question, and I'm going to pose this to Kimberly. What technologies are increasingly being used in the food sector that are, you would say, are the highest risk of cyber attacks?
Thank you, Adrian, for the question. And look, this is a really interesting one, and I gave it quite a lot of thought. I think it's not just one technology that's actually probably of the greatest or the highest risk from a cyber attack perspective. And look, Stuart, I'll be interested in your thoughts on this, but for me, it's this increasing, if you will, this increasing interest in an expanding use of tech by the food industry for really trying to address a number of kind of economic factors that are impacting the business. So things like using technology to actually bridge that talent gap that we're currently seeing with regards to getting the right labor force in place to actually work at the factory level. Also really looking at, the application of and expanding the use of technology to put higher level risk control management in place through the use of tech, kind of starting to move those paper systems out, getting less reliant on the human element, and actually collecting that real-time information with regards to how we're managing and controlling our processes. And finally, a real focus in light of all of the cost of living pressure as of late from a consumer's perspective, but also cost pressures within an operational environment in our manufacturing environment and our supply environment, is really looking at how can we use technology to gain operational efficiencies. I think historically the food industry has probably been a little bit slower on the uptake of using technology to actually manage and actually really manage risk within our operations. And I think the last 2 to 3 years, it's really highlighted to us some places where we need to take a sharp look from a technology perspective. I guess when I think about the increased use of technology holistically, and the fact that it's really every time, and listening to Stuart talk, every time we actually add a new piece of technology or start to look at doing something from a digitally enabled perspective, we're increasing the variability or the vulnerability of our operations to the potential from some type of attack. And a couple of things that stood out for me when I was thinking about the different types of technologies that organizations are using is, this increasing looking at real-time control or getting real-time data brought back into our system, using really digitally enabled pieces of manufacturing equipment in our processes. Every piece of that connected equipment actually provides a link back into our organization, potentially into our IP, potentially into what we do. And from a food safety perspective, have we actually taken the time to think about what that link means in terms of vulnerability and risk in the overall manufacturing of safe food? The other piece is thinking about how and the types of ways that we're connecting with our supply chains, whether that be through service providers or actual suppliers, and how we're actually getting and exchanging information with those organizations. So an attack may actually, another vector to attack from our business and our internal operations could be not necessarily through a piece of equipment or something that's in-house in our business, but actually through an attack on our service provider or through one of our suppliers that we're actually working in a collaborative manner through some kind of a digital type of supplier portal. Stuart, anything that you'd like to add from a cyber perspective?
I think some of the challenges I kind of pick up on what you're talking about there, I guess, around the connected devices, Internet of Things devices, right? So this, I guess, explosion of sorts in the use of connected devices to do specific tasks, right? It's and a lot of us will be familiar with those in our home life as well, right? Things like our smart speakers and our Amazon Alexas, and probably setting them all off now. But they're devices designed to do particular things like cameras and sensors. And I guess the challenge with those is, where you own the device, whether that's me, whether it's your business, your organization, is we don't have much control sometimes over how they work or how they're configured or how they're updated or how they're secured. It's a proprietary system, often sealed, self-contained. So in many ways, it's beyond our control. We're just feeding it power, we're feeding it network connections and taking its output. And if we can't control these, I guess about this, the cyber risk with those kind of devices is we can't control them. How do we know what vulnerabilities they're introducing to our environment? How can we kind of mitigate those risks if we don't know what they are?
Mm-hmm. And, thanks both of you. And that kind of brings us to our next question, considering all of these connected systems and also what Kimberly mentioned about using technology to plug some of those gaps that we're seeing in the food industry. My next question I'd like to pose to both of you, and I guess perhaps we could start with Stuart. So when you're evaluating the installation or the use of new technologies or digital systems, what are some of the hidden vulnerabilities that companies have to keep in mind?
It's a good question. So I was thinking about this one, and you could turn it on its head to some extent, this question as well, right? And what I mean by that is part of our job is to do everything we can to avoid the unknown. We don't want to introduce unknowns and unknown systems into an environment that we don't understand. Kind of going back to my point just a few seconds ago. So companies should be evaluating risks around new systems, new technologies, well before they're implemented. So Like, for example, it's really common for security to be one of the final considerations. So we see separation between, I guess, what is viewed as IT and security teams and the rest of the business. So, you see many situations in the cybersecurity world where a company's going through a procurement process for a new system, a new technology of some kind, and they go through quite a long process, and they evaluate different vendors, and they identify a preferred vendor, and then they engage the cybersecurity team at that point. And they find they get a hard time. They get asked lots of questions. And by the way, this is where security professionals sometimes can be a little bit unfairly seen as blockers. But really, we're just trying to ensure we secure our world. So these situations, to some extent, can be avoided by considering the cyber security requirements, when you initiate those projects. So that's kind of building the cyber requirements into the non-functional requirements when you look to build something or procure something, and working with cyber specialist teams internally, externally, so that you're kind of aiming for this secure by design approach and mindset, as opposed to this sort of retrospective fitting of controls into something. In terms of hidden vulnerabilities, I guess that there are other areas that are frequently missed as well. Kimberly touched on this. Reliance on third-party service providers is absolutely one of them. It's kind of a layered threat. There's that reliance on, is that vendor going to keep their product updated and secure? Will their business be, or is their business sustainable? Will it be there in 2, 3, 4 years' time supporting that product? Are we getting into contracts where the vendor is giving us guarantees around how they'll maintain that product going forwards? And then there are technical concerns. Again, Kimberly kind of touched on this, but do those third parties need access into your network? Do they need to access those devices to manage them, update them, secure them, fault fix them? There's all these kind of layers of risk that often do get missed and can result in those hidden vulnerabilities. And if those organizations, your vendors, if they do need that access, are they secure? How do we know they're secure? And could an incident within the vendor affect you, or perhaps one that we should be more concerned about, or equally concerned about, is could they be used as a stepping stone to attack your environment? So are they going to potentially be the weak link in the chain that can lead to a compromise? So I think it's kind of like the trust but verify approach, right? Which is, I guess, if you're installing new systems and technologies, and we're all concerned about the unknown and the things we don't know, is you absolutely need to do due diligence before you do that and before you get those systems, but also verify once in place. Don't set and forget, don't install and leave these devices and applications on your network. So, run security testing, use activities like penetration testing and application testing, and they're designed to identify weaknesses in your systems, and use those on an ongoing basis, so that those systems that you don't have as much control over and you may miss problems with, you're giving yourself a much better chance of identifying problems proactively and therefore resolving them before somebody else finds that same issue.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Stuart. And Kimberly, what are your thoughts on that?
Look, I'd just like to build a bit on all the things that Stuart said. I think fantastic insight into kind of the types of questions, the things that really we need to be thinking and having that joined up approach. And I think too commonly from my space and working, historically working as a food safety professional, kind of working within that technical group and looking after product safety and product quality in whether it be in a manufacturing environment or from a corporate level, is often we kind of think about, as we make changes or new systems are brought into place, we look at all the really wonderful bells and whistles or all the things that are going to they're going to offer us by way of making our job easier, actually giving us greater insight and greater detail with regards to how the processing conditions are being controlled. We often probably don't know the questions to ask, or we're not given the opportunity to ask the questions that we need to be asking about those systems in respect to really how and when we do set points. If they have particular processing control set points, how and when and what should we be doing to verify those? What is the security pro formas that sit around that? How easy is it to make changes with that type of technology? If we're looking at kind of systems that we're using to manage our documentation or to share information up and down our supply chain with regards to product composition or product manufacture or specifications, do we ask the questions, do we have the opportunity and do we actually ask the questions with regards to, what and how are those security measures in place with regards to controlling that IP, controlling that information and that data that's held in those systems. And I think one of the things we need to make sure that we're doing is really engaged with that IT or that engineering group that are making those systematic changes, looking at the options from a digital enablement perspective, and actually being prepared to talk about the security of those systems. Think about it in the context of if there was information in those systems, or if it's controlling and gathering data that's imperative to us being able to demonstrate our due diligence around managing the production of, say, food, then we need to understand exactly how those security measures work, and we need to work through how we're going to incorporate those into the critical verification activities that we have in our systems for managing food safety, as well as monitoring those practices of the people that are working with that technology.
Great. Thank you both for those insights. So the next thing we're going to move on to is a poll, an audience poll. So we're going to ask you guys to give your thoughts on how is your company expanding the use of technology to more effectively or efficiently manage operational risk. So your answer choices are real-time control and monitoring of our processes, using suppliers with technology-enabled cloud-based reporting services, management of supplier qualification and approval, all of the above, or no changes or plans for investment in technology. So we'll give everybody about 10 to 15 more seconds to read those answers and respond. We appreciate your participation in the poll. It's always interesting to see how these results shake out. All right, we've got a lot of answers coming in here. Wait a few more seconds for people to respond. Still have some answers coming in, so we'll give you all a few more seconds. Okay, and it looks like we've got most of our answers in, so we'll go ahead and go to the results. So it looks like the greatest proportion of the attendees have answered all of the above with 34%, kind of closely followed by 23% real-time control and monitoring of our processes. So Kimberly and Stuart, I'll let you guys discuss that a little bit and tell us what those answers mean.
When I look at them, from my perspective, it tells me that there's a great need to actually understand, from a food safety perspective, to understand those technologies better, understand and be able to be prepared to ask the questions with regards to the security of those systems, and really shift our focus and think with regards to what are the questions we need to be asking and how well do we understand where we may have they may add additional risk or vulnerability to the way that we actually manage food safety in our operations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I guess looking at these responses, the majority of people are kind of highlighting real-time control and monitoring, and all of the above as well, and cloud access. And Kimberly, we've talked about this before. In cybersecurity, we talk about the three tenets being confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. And the thing that maybe I kind of comes to mind when I look at these numbers is it's not just about availability. And I know I talked a little bit about ransomware and systems being available. Is the information accurate? Can you trust and rely on that information? Because you're making important decisions based on information. So how do we know that that information hasn't in any way been changed maliciously or otherwise? And I guess that's another part of this we haven't really talked about, which is the integrity of the data.
Mm-hmm. All right, great. Thank you both for those insights on the poll. So we're going to move ahead now to our next discussion topic, since we've got a lot of things still to talk about. All right, so Stuart, I'm going to pose this to you. So can you talk a little bit about what are the risk indicators or the warning signs of a cyber attack that food businesses really need to know about?
Yeah, so in terms of, I guess, warning signs, there are quite a few things an organization could notice. Some of those are going to be technical and some of those are more around people. So from a technical perspective, from a people perspective first, maybe you need to think about your workforce from a security perspective as being the eyes and ears on the ground, right? These are people that see things that are happening, maybe can identify suspicious activity or events and potential incidents. So we need our teams to report suspicious behavior, suspicious activities and events back to us so we can investigate. That's not as easy as it sounds. We need people to have a sense of what is suspicious, what is unusual, what does a warning sign mean, and of course we can try and address that to some extent through things like training and awareness training and making people more aware of what good and bad security looks like. But we also need to empower people, so we need to think about do they feel empowered to report something that seems suspicious? Do we have a culture that promotes security throughout, not just within technical teams? So, I guess an example from the real world about that, around this is, let's say a person in your organization clicks on a link in an email or opens an attachment and immediately regrets that decision and thinks, hey, this could be suspicious, right? And something bad could have happened here. Will that person report this to their IT and their security teams if there's a bad culture, a blame culture around these kind of things? They probably won't. So we need to get early warning signs from people as well as technology. And we need good training and culture where everyone feels they're responsible for this. They are all part of this across the whole business. And where people are even recognised or rewarded for reporting those incidents and not seen as a problem. I guess from a technical perspective, a basic premise with incidents and with cyber incidents is the sooner we can detect something bad happening, the sooner we can disrupt it, prevent it and contain it, and then hopefully limit the impact of that problem. I guess the same applies to obviously things that are reported by people as well, right? It's the sooner the better. But in terms of the tech, there are potential warning signs everywhere, but there are some big challenges in how we actually identify those warning signs. So, I'll give you an example. There are many different things, but if we look at perhaps just IT and OT infrastructure, applications, systems, devices, they generate a lot of digital noise. So things like logs, alerts, warnings, and so on. And to spot an attack and to kind of get that early warning that there's something's happening, you need to know what to look for. You need to know what you're looking for. And more importantly, you need to know where to look. You need to know what systems, what applications am I actually trying to protect. And it sounds simple, but often it's one of the biggest challenges that organizations will face is understanding their environment. And if you don't have a good understanding of that environment and your assets and what systems you have, then you are less likely to detect and spot those early warning signs. So there are lots of tools, obviously, that are out there and designed to do this job. And they work by gathering logs, information, data from networks, devices, and, talked about the IoT devices earlier, and they're an important part of this. And how do we get useful data from those? And we analyze those. We analyze that information and we try and correlate and look for events and we try to make sense of that. So that could be, comparing the information we see on our network with information we have about how particular attacks work and kind of what the anatomy of attack looks like. So for example, if we know how a particular piece of ransomware works, we know how it communicates with the internet. We know what access it needs. If we can identify that activity through our logging and our analysis and understand, well, actually, we're seeing internet traffic going to a particular place that we know to be malicious. It therefore gives us that early warning. Something is happening, something bad is happening. If possible, we're going to isolate and contain the problem, and that minimizes the potential impact of that situation, and we're trying to stop it, therefore, from escalating to a point where perhaps it's affected, something bigger, and the attacker has potentially a much greater level of control over your environment. So I said there are many warning signs across the people and technology space, and I guess that's just a couple of examples.
Great, thanks, Stuart. Kimberly, anything to add?
No, it probably leads well into thinking about those strategies and things that people need to be thinking about. So I'll let you move on.
Great, thank you. And yeah, that does lead really well into our next discussion topic, which I'm also going to pose to Stuart. So, given that we understand now about what the warning signs of an attack could look like, what strategies or controls does a company need to have in place to prevent cybercrime or a cyber attack?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of controls, I guess many of the controls are apply to all IT settings, regardless of your sector. But also, as I kind of mentioned earlier, you need that awareness of your own particular environment, threats that may exist, particularly within your sector or within your peers. And it's important to kind of use that intelligence about those specific threats that apply to your organization, because they can help you pick the right level of controls and they can help you understand what you should be doing. I guess touching back to a point I made just a few minutes ago, you also need to know where your data is. What is it we're trying to protect? Is it data assets? Is it devices? Is it the physical assets? Because we can't protect something that we can't see. I think a really important point that I guess thought about when we looked at this question, and I really want to stress, is don't look at IT and cyber risks in isolation from the rest of the business. I'm not saying for a second that our technical colleagues, our IT teams don't focus on security, but without defining requirements of how we protect something, how can we expect the controls in place to be appropriate? So, our IT folk, they're there to manage systems, keep them running, ensure that they can deliver the functionality that we need when we need it, and reliably and predictably. But we shouldn't assume that those teams somehow automatically know the criticality of the systems or the data that you use those systems to store, or, we talked about the accuracy of the data. We shouldn't assume that they understand that, because why would they if we haven't kind of discussed it and analysed it? So it comes back to risk management, looking at assets, looking at your data and making sure you understand the information that you care about, you're trying to protect, and understanding how those assets fit into your business and assess risks related to those assets. So, we need to identify risks and then understand the impacts of those risks in the context of the wider business. So really what I'm saying is you need to include cyber risk management in the overall risk management processes of the organization. Don't look at it as IT is the risk. It's much more nuanced and complex than that. And it's that wider business risk appetite that should be driving the controls you put in place. Coming back to the question of which strategies and controls do we need. So, as an example, may be helpful in terms of how risk can inform decisions. You may have a board that has quite a high risk tolerance. They may want to be quite disruptive and highly innovative in what they do. That could mean they do prioritize implementing new technology to drive change, to be innovative, to drive productivity or revenue. And they may prioritize that over cybersecurity. Now, that in itself isn't inherently bad. I use this example because it shows you that if the decision makers understand the risks and impact, then they can set the tone and direction. Conversely, they may be very risk averse, which should inform the level of control you need. But equally, if you don't understand the cyber risks in the context of the wider business and their objectives, it can lead to inappropriate, ineffective strategies for the controls that you put in place to manage risk. I guess a final point I'll put in place around strategies to kind of prevent cybercrime is we do need to test the controls we put in place as well. Talking about controls is great, and we talk about lots of different technologies and processes and so on, but we need to test them, and we need to test how effective they are. So we would expect most organizations to be making the most of those kind of different testing mechanisms we have. So that's things like, are we scanning our environment for vulnerabilities? There are good automated ways of doing that and understanding the issues that may mean our controls aren't effective, and then trying to remediate them proactively. So there are also, I think I mentioned this earlier, but things like penetration testing, where we can look to understand from the perspective of an attacker, are those controls good enough? Are they sufficient to keep the penetration tester, the criminal, from accessing our systems? So a penetration test is a process where, in a more controlled way, we'll simulate the behavior of a criminal and identify those, or attempt to identify those weaknesses. So, it's about picking the right controls, but it's also about then testing those controls and making sure that they are doing what you need them to do, and then using what you learn from that to make, good informed decisions about your strategy and kind of how effective it is.
Great. Thank you, Stuart. And, taking that whole business approach to cybersecurity and cyber risk kind of leads into my next question, which I'm going to pose to Kimberly. And what this really boils down to here is, how can a cyber attack pose a threat or a risk to food safety?
Great. Thanks, Adrian. And this is, Stuart, there's so much great information that you've shared, kind of talking about those risk indicators and looking at those strategies, and really kind of has brought, in a number of strands and a number of places that I could go to actually expand on this particular topic. I think often when we think about cyber risk, we think about it in the context of ransomware. So we think about it in the fact that we have a ransomware attack, it shuts down our systems, we don't have access to be able to operate or to be able to move things. We don't actually think about it in the context of if we can't operate, or if our operations are impacted by an attack and we have perishable food that's being held and we lose access and control of the temperature control processing mechanisms, that can have a direct impact on the safety of that particular product and our ability to actually move that product through the system in the manner in which we need to do by and within a very short shelf life in order to get it to consumer while it's still safe to eat. There's many other things that we need to think about, and I think that's one of the things that I would implore, those of you that are on this call that, are really looking at kind of those food safety risks and understanding kind of the impact of that digital enabled environment, and really step back and think about where we've got technology in the business, what is the risk? And a few examples that I think that I'd love to share in response to this question is, thinking about breaches in site security. Where is that potential from a food safety risk? It is around that tampering component. So looking at what are those types of security systems that we have in place? What are using to actually control the actual security of our site and our operations? Do we actually test that as part of our overall verification of how well we're managing the risk of threats to food safety? Likewise, another one in thinking about, how do those materials, or how do our products move through the supply chain? When they're either coming in and coming to us from our suppliers, or they're going out the door and going into a retailer, into a consumer environment. How well, where do we have critical links within that supply chain, whereby we're reliant on technical information, or we've got security measures, or we have various different types of digital enablement that we're using to manage that product as it's moving through the supply chain? Do we really understand where there is a potential by way of tampering with those particular products that could be not be transparent to us as they move through the system? I think the other one that it really just strikes me, and it comes back to, Stuart, the point that you made with regards to the integrity of the data and the information. So when we think about the type of information we have, we often think very much around the availability of the information or our operations. We equally need to think about the confidentiality of that information that we might have that people want to get their hands on, as well as the accuracy of that information. And that brings me into, where we're using technology to manage and support, batching controls, recipe creation, and recipe, the actual application of what the recipe is that we're actually manufacturing to, as well as looking at those processing parameters. And I've already spoken about storage conditions. What are the vulnerabilities that we may have in respect to the manipulation of that information and the accuracy, the overall accuracy of that particular information with regards to the products that we're manufacturing and offering for consumption? And I guess the final piece in thinking about how we share data with regards to the manufacture of products that may be co-manufactured on our behalf, that use our logo, our labels, our very, very the core of what actually makes our brand and the reputation of our brand real is, how do we actually communicate that to individuals? How the outside of our direct operation, outside of our direct business, and how are we preventing, or how and what is the risk of unauthorized use of those materials to actually, in fact, potentially offer fraudulent products that look exactly like our own out into the market for consumers.
Absolutely, very important points, Kimberly. Thanks for sharing those. So we're going to move on to our next audience poll now. And the question for you all is, who in your organization is responsible for cyber risk management across your supply chain? And your answers available are IT and security, enterprise risk management, operations, technical, or a cross-functional team. So we'll give you all about 10 to 15 seconds to answer that question, and then we'll discuss the results. Got a lot of responses coming in here. Appreciate your participation in the polls. Give a few more seconds for some answers to come in. Still got a few answers coming in. Thank you, guys. All right, looks like we've got the bulk of the responses in, so we'll move to the results. So it looks like we've got a clear trend here for IT and security. Also see some cross-functional team there. So I'll let Stuart and Kimberly talk about those results a little bit.
I think what's interesting, what immediately jumps out to there is that 60% IT security. I guess that doesn't necessarily mean the wider business isn't involved, but you know, I guess the ownership of cyber risk management sitting with IT and security, the concern from experience there is always, are we bringing in those people from the wider business that, particularly when it comes to understanding impact and asset value, can inform that risk process? Because, you know, Kimberly just talked about, you know, we tend to think about things like ransomware and availability, but it's those other two elements. It's is the information confidential and is it reliable, that perhaps we don't have context in from an IT cyber perspective. So I think it's very interesting to kind of see those numbers and see that the majority of people are owning that within IT or security functions.
Great, thanks, Stuart. Kimberly, do you have anything to add on these results?
Oh, look, I think I'm going to leave it and we'll carry on, shall we?
Sure. All right. So let's move to our next discussion topic, and I'm going to pose this to Kimberly. So given everything we've discussed so far, why do you think that companies need to consider cybersecurity as an important element of their food defense program?
I think first and foremost, because it's not just about the systems, it's not just about the IT, it's not just about the security. As we move toward becoming more digitally enabled, using higher levels of technology, and clearly we are, because that was really clear from the first poll. Mm-hmm. We are from a food safety perspective, we understand best that risk impact that Stuart was talking about. So we understand if something goes wrong with that technology, what the risk impact would be in the context of the consumers, our brand, our products. We need to look at it holistically from a risk appetite perspective. It's not just about the availability of the systems. It's about what information is contained in those systems and what could happen if that information is not accurate or it's not maintained in a confidential manner. I think it's really easy from a food safety perspective to say, look, we're going to devolve that responsibility to IT and systems because they understand all the jargon and they understand kind of all that cybery stuff because I can't understand that. And I think, in spending time with Stuart and actually working through kind of putting together this webinar with him, he gave me a great appreciation for the fact that It's not about the tech, it's about the information. When we look at cybercrime, it's about getting access to that information, getting access to the stuff that is valuable to our business. And I think what we need to understand and what we need to accept is we probably understand those impacts, the value, the impacts, the food safety risks, and the value of the information that we're actually collecting through the application of a lot of this new technology that we're looking at. And as a consequence, and often kind of and how we actually manage food safety, we rely a lot on the systems that we use to actually help us give those, if you will, those points in time with regards to where we need to take a closer look, where we need to actually underpin our everyday practices and processes with the right verification methods. And I think one of the key elements of any food safety management system that actually helps us with that verification process in respect to threats and true threats to our overall brand, to the overall food safety of the products that we manufacture, is through our food defense program. I could sit here and say, look, you need to do it because every GFSI standard says we must have, a food defense program and it needs to include this, this, and this. But, and cyber risk being one of those elements. I think in my working with organizations, it's often difficult to actually bring that true cyber risk impact into the business by way of an understanding of how that can impact on food safety and where does it fit in that overall system that we actually employ to manage food safety across our business. Perfect fit for me. That's where I actually see it coming in, and we need to be less shy about actually saying this is a key component that we need to actually really understand. And we need to make sure that the practices and processes that we've built into our food defense program actually address those true risks and the impact that increasing use of technology in our operations introduce to us.
Great. Thank you, Kimberly. So the next question I'm going to pose to both Kimberly and Stuart. Now, let's talk a little bit about what triggers companies should review to test the efficacy of their food defense program to remain confident that their cybersecurity controls are providing adequate protection.
Look, I'm happy to start on this one, Stuart, and then I'd love to hear your perspective from somebody that sits in kind of a different side of that verification space. And from my perspective is, and what we work in for many years have often worked on kind of the theory of, if you understand that there's been a change in process, in practice, or in the environment, that we need to be going back and looking at the key mechanisms that we have to manage and control risk related to food safety. So if I take and look at applying that general theory that I've always applied and for many years is, if there is something that happens, and from a horizon scanning perspective, we identify that there's been a recent type of cyber attack or a potential threat with regards to a water supply, we need to be going back and looking at that food defense program, really looking and testing the key components to make sure that we've actually captured those particular elements in relation to potential for risk impact in our operations. Likewise, each and every time we look at actually increasing or upgrading the technology that we're using within our operations or changing our supply sources, we need to be asking ourselves the question with regards to what's the impact from a systems perspective, what's the impact on risk, what is the potential for a heightened level of threat related to the way that we actually run and manage our business. I don't see this as a set and forget. I see this as a critical component with regards to really staying in tune with what those true threats are, when those threat frequencies change or may change, indicators that are actually happening in the market or within our own business, and making sure that we're actually going through rigorous testing internally to ensure that our protocols, our practices are still going to deliver us the right level of protection and understanding. Anything to add, Stuart?
I think the kind of horizon scanning is an interesting one. It's kind of trying to draw parallels, I guess, with the cyber world, and in terms of applying that same process and that same approach, and in the security context, it would include things like considering emerging threats and trends from a cyber perspective. So, we can use threat intelligence, we can get insight into real world techniques that criminals are using and are likely to be using, and we can look to understand how do they operate, maybe who are they, or what technologies are they targeting or might they be targeting next. So, we can consider, we talked about the Internet of Things, we can consider the increasing use of the Internet of Things. They're already quite prevalent, but what should we try to understand? What's coming next, and how could that impact on food organisations if the prevalence of that kind of technology is only going one direction, and that's that it's increasing. And in terms of, I guess, triggers more generally, we could talk about some specific technology and cyber related triggers. So, I think about things like change management, fundamental in how we manage our IT and our OT world. And, we have processes in place to analyse the impact of things before a change is made. And you see organisations doing quite a good job of having change approval processes that are quite robust, but maybe they focus on business impacts only. So they might focus, well, if we implement this new system, how will we migrate our data? Have we tested that? And that's great, but it's also an opportunity to be saying, does this change have a cyber impact? Is there someone in the room asking that question, even though maybe on the surface they're not anything to do with that particular change? So, that can certainly be a trigger, and one that's often missed. One I wanted to talk about as well is it's a trigger, and that's an incident. So an incident should always trigger some kind of review, and that may sound obvious, but you should see an incident also as an opportunity to review your controls, and I'd include near misses in that as well. So if you have issues that had the potential to become a fully blown incident but perhaps were avoided, they absolutely look at those. Think about, were your controls effective? Did you or would you have contained that incident? And again, in the wider business context, how do people outside of IT respond to that incident or that near miss? And we encourage our customers and our clients to use incident response playbooks for common types of incidents. So think about the things that are most likely to happen and create playbooks and build out scenarios that talk about, okay, here's what we will do if this happens. It will trigger this playbook, it will trigger this response. And that should include not just IT, but people from across the business. And as well as learning from our own incidents, learn about things that happen to our peers. Learn from things happening in the wider world. If a peer experiences a particular problem, reflect on that and say, okay, evaluate, how would we have reacted to that same threat? What would we have done? Would it have affected us in the same way? And I guess the final point on triggers, to kind of flip it around a little bit, is the wording of the question is interesting, because yes, triggers exist, but also how can we be more proactive and trigger things ourselves proactively, not waiting for something to happen. And that's where I think, my point about cybersecurity being part of the wider business comes back in, because we have frameworks, we have things like, information security management systems, where it's not just about technical controls, it's about wrapping the business controls around it. So putting in place a management system mindset and thinking about continuous improvement, and thinking about, rather than relying on reacting to something, let's mature ourselves, let's put in place these proactive mechanisms. So, engaging stakeholders at a top management level, because we've talked about the importance of the wider risk context, and putting risk at the center of the decision making. So, and I'm not necessarily talking about formal compliance against frameworks like ISO 27001, but taking the kind of the spirit and the intent of those, and understanding, okay, if we look to adopt these standards, they make us more proactive. They help us evaluate and measure the effectiveness of our controls. They make us audit the effectiveness of our controls, and they help us understand, if we fail to do something, if there are non-conformities within our control sets, what can we learn from that? So I think there's kind of like reactive and proactive triggers we should all be thinking about, really, when it comes to kind of preventing attacks.
And if I could just add a quick point, I think that's something that we're actually quite good with. So when we talk about, as professionals that work in that space with regards to really focusing on quality and looking at the safety of the products that we manufacture, we actually probably would have very high level skills in that context of actually trying to be more proactive, actually have built in some of those frameworks already. I think that what we need to do is really start to look at then how do we incorporate that into that context of that cyber security or that systems and IT world, and make sure that we've got the right connections in place, and even in some respects potentially make them better from a continuous improvement perspective.
Great. Thank you both for those insights. Really great points, both. So to conclude our discussion, we're going to wrap up with one more audience poll. And this question for all of you is, how frequently do you test your food defense program specifically for cyber incident impact? And the answers to choose from are annually, but not necessarily for a cyber incident scenario, annually for each food defense risk, including cyber, at least annually, but more frequently if there's a major cyber incident reported by our supply chain, whenever horizon scanning indicates a new cyber threat has occurred, or our food defense program does not include cyber risk or security. So we'll give everybody another 10 or 15 seconds to answer that poll, and then we'll discuss the results. Okay, just a few more seconds. Still got a few answers rolling in. Okay, and it looks like we've got mostly everybody responding, so we'll move on to the answers. All right, so it looks like the majority of people said annually, but not necessarily for a cyber incident scenario. And then the runner-up was, our food defense program does not include cyber risk or security. So I will let Stuart and Kimberly address those two interesting responses.
Stuart, I'd love your perspective.
So it's interesting that kind of over a third of people are not necessarily including cyber incident scenarios in their testing. Now, obviously, you know, I kind of said food industry is not my specialism, but I find it very interesting, and I wonder what the reasons behind that might be, and if there are challenges that are actually making that difficult for kind of our attendees to do.
When I look at it, what that's telling me is there's nearly, I'm doing the maths quickly in my head, Adrian, there's close to 60% of the people that they're not even looking at cyber as part of that food defense piece specifically. And with the increasing use of technology, you know, it's saying to me that there's a gap that, you know, really needs to be a focus for the coming year with regards to ways to look at closing that gap, and hoping that through the conversation today, and you and I kind of sharing the two perspectives, being able to demonstrate that you actually can come to one place to kind of get this better understanding of kind of the risk, but also looking at it in the context of the food safety risk impact and the importance of doing so.
Absolutely. Well, great discussion, both of you, and we appreciate the audience's involvement with all of the polls. We've had a really thorough discussion today, and not too much time for questions, but I would like to pose at least one to our panelists so that we get to some of them. And of course, our panelists can get to all of your other questions offline. So I'm going to take a minute here and pose one question to both of you. And I think, Stuart, you could speak about this from a cyber perspective, and Kimberly from a food industry perspective. What would you say is just some general principles around what makes a good food defense program?
Do you want to start there, Kimberly?
Now I'll start that one, Stuart. In all fairness, I will start that one. I think what's really important in looking at your food defense program and understand is really to think about what are those true threats to food safety. And it's not just the list that appears in the general standards. It's some of those questions that I raised, if you will, or some of that information that I shared previously with regards to, how there can be a risk from a cyber perspective. We need to think about those things and where we have not just internally within our organization, how we manage and secure our operations, but also look more broadly and think about where are those chinks in our armor, or where could those potential chinks in our armor be across our supply chain. We need to spend quite a lot of time not looking at it from this is a food fraud risk, this is a cyber risk, we need to holistically look at that true risk to the safety of our food, and where we have potential gaps that we could have people actually take actions that could really unwind what we do each and every day to do everything to the absolute best. And I think one of my key takeaways in speaking to Stuart is thinking about that data, thinking about that information that's so important for us to be able to demonstrate due diligence with regards to the safety of the food that we're producing. Thinking about how do we collect it, what do we do with it, how do we store it, and actually how do we really manage and demonstrate the overall safety of the food that we manufacture, and make sure that we're protecting any kind of vectors that could come in and actually disrupt that.
Great. Thank you, Kimberly. Stuart, do you have anything you want to add for that question?
I think really just to kind of, I guess, build on that and agree with the principle of that, which is it's start with the assets, start with understanding what it is we're trying to protect, and work out from there. Don't start with technology and servers and devices and work in. You need to be robust in that risk management approach and start by understanding what it is we're trying to protect in the first place.
Mm-hmm. All right, great. Thank you both for entertaining that question. So that is all the time, unfortunately, that we have for questions and for our webinar today. But please join me in thanking Kimberly and Stuart for their discussion, as well as our sponsor, LRQA. Now, if you have any other additional questions or comments, please don't hesitate to click that email us button on the console. And also you can visit food-safety.com for the archive of this presentation, as well as more information about our upcoming events and webinars. So we appreciate everybody's time today and your participation in the polls. Hope you found that interesting, and hope you've also found this webinar to be a valuable experience, and we hope everybody has a great day.